Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to BibleQuest.org. If you're joining us through the live Zoom app, be sure to open the question and answer window. Click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We want you to use that window. We want to hear from you with your questions. Text them in, your questions or comments. So please be sure to use the Q&A box. By the way, for you that are using the app, you also have the ability to raise your hand. There's a little hand icon there. You can click on it. Now, if you do raise your hand, it's possible for us to give you the opportunity to talk with us on the air live if you want, but we'll communicate with you first. If you want, just raise your hand. Now, if you're joining us through Facebook, you only have the option to text us your questions or comments using that comment box on the Facebook page. Well, with all of that said, now let me welcome our panelist, Scott Smelter. He's coming in from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Hi, Scott. How you doing today? You enjoying that spring weather down there?
Yes, I am, Drew. Beautiful day down here. Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. Along with Scott, also from Gettysburg, the historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Stephen Rouse. Hi, Stephen. How you doing down there?
Hey, welcome everybody. Doing well down here.
Great. And I'm your host, Drew DeGrotto, broadcasting live from Honesdale, Pennsylvania. So today we want to talk about a story which most of us are familiar with the story. But there's a few things in it that maybe we haven't considered before. And the story begins with Jesus wanting to go north from Judea up to Galilee. And in between those two areas is that area that we're familiar with called Samaria. Just as a little background on Samaria. Samaria, that was the northern kingdom, several hundred years before all of this, when there was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And when Assyria came in and took and captured the northern kingdom, the way Assyria did these things, they'd go in and capture the land, take out the prime people, the upper echelon, and they would bring in other cultures from other areas, maybe not prime, definitely not prime, lower cultured people, and they'd bring them in to try to get them to assimilate, trying to get that the local people will not continue to serve their gods and have this intermingling. Well, as time went on, the northern people still hung on to their Jewish heritage. And in fact, they gave honor to the 5 books of Moses. Not necessarily all of the prophets, but the books of Moses, the 5 books they recognized. And so they did consider themselves Jewish. They had that same consideration that the Jews in Judea had. Well, as we know, the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along at all. In fact, they hated each other for that very reason, that they were a mixed group. And it's important to realize that too, because as the story, like any of the stories that we read in the Bible that include Samaritans, we want to realize the differences between these two cultures and the peoples themselves. Scott, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, well, a couple of comments on that too. So what they have in common with the Jews is, like you said, a belief in the 5 books of Moses, and they are circumcised. Of course, that's back in the 5 books of Moses. Probably technically we wouldn't say that they consider themselves Jews, because Jew is short for Judah. And the northern tribes, whatever little remnant there had been left, those would have been Israel as opposed to Judah, which
Good point.
Back after Babylon. Just as an aside, it's kind of interesting to note the different ways that the Assyrians and the Babylonians and then the Persians tended to deal with people. The Assyrians moved them around, kind of like if we got conquered by, say, some great foreign power, and they just picked us up and put us all in Norway. And then they put the Norwegians in Spain and the Spaniards in Canada. You kind of lose your desire to get your independence back when you're out of pocket. The Babylonians took the Jews to Babylon, and you're captive there. And then the Persians, they're going to repatriate peoples to where they go. But it as you described, it left this situation in the Samaria with these mixed blood with all these people of other nations. And that brings us into the text.
And one more thing about that before we start in John 4 is the background there in 2 Kings 17, verse 28 and then verse 29. It's notable that the king of Assyria commands to get one of the priests from Israel and have them teach the resettled people in Samaria how they ought to fear the Lord. But, verse 29, every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that you've got people who've learned the 5 books of Moses. They're being taught the law by the priests, but then they kind of mix it with all the different idolatrous stuff that they're bringing in.
And when we get into Ezra and Nehemiah, and particularly we're going to see when the Jews come back from Babylon, the Samaritans are going to be interfering and causing trouble. So with that background, here we are in John 4. Verse 3, he left Judea, as Drew had pointed out, and departed again for Galilee. He had to pass through Samaria. He came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It's about the 6th hour. It's noon, so it's lunchtime. All right, so here we are, Jacob's well. That's what it looked like in the 1800s. If you go and look at it today, it looks more like this, but that's not what it looked like then. Comments? Any more setting of the stage we need?
I think so.
All right. So he's there, and a woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans."
Now, there's the point that we were trying to make, that, I mean, she identified it right off the top. And not only that, what makes it worse is she's a woman.
Yeah.
Whether you're a Jew in your own culture, usually their culture says men do not speak with women publicly by themselves. Well, not necessarily publicly, but by themselves. Should be another man with that woman, her husband or a family member.
One of the Pharisee line of rabbis from the Pharisee line once said, "Don't speak much with women, not even your own wife." So,
whoa.
So here you've got a Jewish guy has stopped by the well, and a Samaritan, like you said, woman comes up, and he immediately makes conversation with her and asks for a drink. And so she's kind of, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And then John's editorial comment, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.
Yeah. And just as a side note, as we think about this, it's interesting just to see the way that Jesus interacts with different kinds of people, especially in the book of John, but also in the other Gospels, and that Jesus will often do unexpected things socially. And we need to think about that as Christians, as sometimes we're very aware of our own cultural boundaries. And for the sake of the gospel, sometimes we need to be willing to cross cultural lines, not to intentionally offend people, but to reach out to people that we might not otherwise talk with. And I appreciate Jesus' willingness here to initiate this conversation. Just, hey, would you give me a drink? But talks to a Samaritan, talks to a woman in this case, and is going to open up the doors for the gospel to not only this woman, but her family and her community. And sometimes it just takes the courage to cross some of those lines to open up all sorts of doors of opportunity.
It's also interesting how Jesus takes a situation as simple as getting a drink of water. He's going to turn it into what?
Wow, that's an open-ended question. Turn it into revealing truth.
Yeah.
Oh, are you talking about living water, turning it into living water?
Yeah. A spiritual discussion.
Spiritual conversation, exactly.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Roderick Crane in the Q&A that says, how did the Samaritan woman know that Jesus was a Jew? What do y'all think about that?
That's a very good question. They knew each other by appearance. The culture, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but the culture definitely, you can look at them. I don't know, Scott, do you think it would be an ethnic appearance or just clothing?
I would, it was probably some of both. You know, you get, in America, we're so used to such a blend, but you get in some foreign countries and, you know, English people tend to look a little bit different than French people. German people look a little different than French people. You know, some of the variations stand out more. Plus how they're dressed. I mean, you know, if we see a guy from Texas, even before he says he's from Texas, we can kind of tell Texan. So whether it was, you know, they would have had a largely genetic makeup, because a lot of what they were genetically would have been non-Jewish, but also probably kind of the way that they dressed. But is this exactly how? I don't know, but they would have known.
But I think Rod brings a good point up. They know each other. They can identify it, and we're not going to have anything to do with you just by the way you look.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And it's interesting, too, it doesn't say that Samaritans refuse to have dealings with Jews, but it certainly says that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.
That's an interesting point. I didn't realize that one. You're right.
I don't know how often it went the other way. We do know in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan is willing to step the other direction, but I don't know how typical that is. All right. Jesus answered her. So she says, yeah, what are you doing asking me for water? So Jesus said, if you knew the gift of God and who it was saying you give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us a well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock.
I like the way you toned that comment, because I'm under the same impression that she's actually mocking him.
Yeah, I think she's kind of annoyed with him.
Annoyed, at least annoyed, not mocking, annoyed.
Yeah, and mocking. You're right. I think that's too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You're
greater than Jacob.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
But he doesn't skip a beat, as Jesus never does.
So here we go. Jesus said, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. Whoever drinks the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The one said to him, sir, give me this water so that I won't be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. And at that point, Jesus says, go call your husband and come here.
You notice he doesn't answer her when she says, are you greater than Jacob? He could have said, I am, but he doesn't. Right? He just says, the water I'm giving you is different than the water you're getting.
He's gotten her attention. He's given her nothing up till this point to change her mind, but he's getting her attention and getting a conversation started. Then at this point, he gives her something to change her mind. She's been pretty sarcastic up to this point. You know, who do you think you are? And then he
this
goes,
is more. She bit off more than she can chew here.
Yeah. Then he says, go call your husband. And the woman said, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true.
Oops.
Yeah. Well,
she identifies them. Go ahead, Stephen, go ahead.
This is really the turning point in the conversation up to this point. He said some intriguing things, but she doesn't seem to be taking them seriously. And at this point, when he tells her, listen, you've had 5 different husbands, and she's like, the next thing she'll say, "Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet."
Yeah.
You were saying some weird stuff, and you're like, "Where are you going to get that living water from? You don't have anything to draw from the well." And now she's like, "Wait a minute, you're not supposed to know that."
Right.
And so the conversation is going to shift after this. But before we move on, if you back up to that last slide where Jesus is saying that the water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Jesus just says some interesting things here about the nature of what he can do for us spiritually. Is that the idea is almost this: you have your own well within you, is the kind of this eternal source of spiritual blessing, of spiritual nourishment. Jesus will say some things farther on in the book of John about streams of water flowing from within. And I think that's just interesting here to see that, again, some of these deep spiritual truths Jesus is giving to a woman that you wouldn't expect initially. And we'll see some more of that as we go on.
And am I remembering wrong or not, or is there not a tie-in here perhaps or something back in Ezekiel along this line?
In Ezekiel's vision, that's a good point. The temple vision in the last 10 chapters or so of Ezekiel 40 through 48, I believe it's in 43, where you have the water coming out from the temple, and then it grows and grows until it becomes this river flowing through the promised land, and it's giving life to everything. So there may be
promises relating to like the Spirit and other things which will tie in later with John. Here's something else also. Oh, go ahead.
There's a lot of references to water throughout the scripture, and Jesus is making and that's, I think you had said earlier, Stephen, it's interesting, or Scott, you might have said it, he starts off with a simple question: give me some water, give me something to drink. And he just goes right now into this full-blown spiritual discussion. Go ahead, Scott.
Ezekiel 47.
If you ever want to go and stand right where Jesus stood, go to Jacob's well. Because there's a lot of tourist identification places they don't go to the tomb of Jesus and expect that's really the tomb of Jesus. But Jacob's well seems to be a geographic spot that's been known for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. And so if you go to Jacob's well, that's apparently right where it is Jacob's well, apparently right where Jesus would have been here. Let me point out something else here on this. In the Greek language in the New Testament, there's not a separate word for wife and a separate word for husband. It's the word man or woman. For instance, in Matthew 1, Joseph took Mary to be his wife. There's not a separate word there for wife. It's Joseph took Mary to be his woman. When Jesus talks about marriage and divorce, whoever puts away his wife and marries another, it's not a separate word for wife. It's whoever puts away his woman and marries another commits adultery. But you can tell when it's a marriage because it's in language like Aquila and his woman Priscilla, and that type of thing. So let's read this passage this way, which would have been more the way it would have sounded. Instead of husband, we'll say man. Jesus said to her, "Go call your man and come here." Jesus said, "I have no man." Jesus said, "You're right in saying you have no man, for you have had 5 men, and the one you have now is not your man. What you have said is true."
Well, that puts a very interesting emphasis on that.
Yes, he's got somebody else's man. And then her sarcasm disappears very quickly up until now. And Drew, you had mentioned that this type of woman and somebody making conversation with her out here at the well, she might be used to like guys trying to get her attention or hit on her or something. And she may just be annoyed with this fella and kind of, swatting him away. But and this nonsense he's saying about, if you knew what kind of water I had, you'd ask of me, you'd never be thirsty again. Oh yeah, give me some of that. Save me a lot of time. All the sarcasm now disappears. Mm-hmm. Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. But it's also interesting, immediately, so he's pegged her. to her situation in life. He knows, he's shown her, he knows what she is. And says, I perceive you're a prophet. Does she then ask him about her situation or anything? She immediately does what?
She turns this conversation away from her and asks him.
And it could be that, she's always had this question and, oh, here's a prophet. I want to ask you this. It could also be, wow, that was a little awkward. Let me get on a different topic. And it could be a little bit of both. I want to get off this awkward subject, but here is something I'd like to ask. So she says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, they're Mount Gerizim. And by the way, Samaritans still do. Back around 1919, National Geographic sent a photography team over and they did a story on the Samaritans. And there are still a few hundred Samaritans left. One of the things that they still do is they still offer the Passover lamb. So if you ever find that old National Geographic thing, you'll see them sacrificing the Passover lamb. That's the only place you'll see it, because after the destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the priesthood, there's no temple and they've lost the priesthood, Jews they celebrate Passover, but they don't do the lamb. As I understand, Orthodox Jews, they'll have like the bitter herbs and I think maybe a dry bone representing the lamb that they no longer have. But the Samaritans, because the loss of the temple didn't affect them so much, they still sacrifice the Passover up there on Mount Gerizim. And that's the issue she's touching on here. Which place? Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And of course, why does she say, Jesus hasn't said that in this conversation? Why does she say here, you say that in Jerusalem is the place people ought to worship?
He's a Jew.
Yeah. This is one of the differences between the Samaritans and the Jews. We say it's here, you say it's there.
One quick question. I'm just not sure about this. Do you think, did they choose Mount Gerizim in part because of the blessings and curses on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal? Is they would pronounce the blessings from Mount Gerizim and the curses from Mount Ebal? I haven't thought about it. That may be it, and there may be something else too, but I haven't thought about it, so I don't have the answer. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of work on that, but I was just curious about that.
Well, it makes sense. If I'm a Samaritan and I want to worship God, I'm not going to choose the one that's a curse. The mountain.
Right.
No, yeah.
Mount Ebal, yeah.
Mount Ebal, yeah.
All right. So Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship that which you do not know. We worship that which we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit. Those that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So before getting into that last phrase, how does he deal with her question there? She goes, so which place is it? Down there, like you say, or up here? And how does Jesus deal with that question?
Well, he sure doesn't pull any punches, does he? He says, you don't know what you're doing. You don't, what you don't know.
Yeah, he lets her know which of those has been correct, but he does it within a context of making clear it's all about to be what?
Changed.
Yeah, it's irrelevant. Changed. Yeah. It directs her attention to something that is yet to come.
Yeah, the Jews have been right about that, but that's really not going to matter anymore. The hour is coming and now is that what God's looking for is people to worship him in spirit and in truth, not in Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Then, what does the woman say?
Before we move on to that next point, I also think it's just really interesting in verse 23 there that he says, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. And that's just interesting. A lot of times we think about seeking God and we need to look for God and search for him. But there's a picture here that Jesus gives that God is looking for this type of person who will worship him in spirit and truth. And when God's looking for something, that should get our attention. We want to be those kind of people. I just think it's an interesting phrase.
No, I like that. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that is a very good point.
Think about, too, the seeking on both ends.
What's that?
Says God is seeking such people, and Jesus says in Sermon on the Mount, those that seek will find. And Paul in Acts 17, God's not far from us if we will seek him. Who was it? The prophet in 2 Chronicles 15, 1 and 2, Oded, was it? Who says to King Asa, God's with you while you're with him, but if you forsake him, he'll forsake you. But if you seek him, he'll let you find him. God, he'll draw near you. Drew.
Yeah, you just made me think of the parables. The reason he was teaching in parables, it was to be hidden from a certain group of people. The story, the meaning was supposed to be hidden from someone.
Yeah.
But it's going to be revealed to a certain other type of people. And what is the type of people it's going to be that the story is going to be revealed to? Those that want to know, what does that mean? And they go to him and seek him to get the answer.
Later in John, he'll thank the Father for revealing it to babes.
Children, babes, yes.
Yeah. All right, anything further there?
Do we want to talk at all about in spirit and truth and some different perspectives on that, or do we want to leave that for another day?
You want to you want to add a little point to that, another point to that? Go right ahead.
Well, I think I grew up hearing the idea that worshiping God in spirit and truth is the idea of kind of, in spirit is with energy, like you really mean it, and then in truth is like the correct outward form. But in the context of John, it seems at least that in spirit is most often used like in contrast with, of the flesh, in kind of a fleshly focused way. And so in spirit has to do with more of a spiritual focus on the worship. And in truth would have to do with that idea of in the right form. Her question has to do with, this mountain or that mountain. Jesus says, salvation is from the Jews. They've got it right on the Jerusalem part. But there's something deeper here that you need to focus on, and that is the spiritual nature of the worship of God. God is a spirit. He's not like one of us. And it reminds me of some of the things that Paul says in the sermon in Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill, where, we shouldn't think that God is like these objects of wood or stone or this other stuff. No, like God's a spirit. And those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth, is the emphasis that he gives here.
And Jesus is later going to say in the Gospel of John, in John 14:6, I am the way and the truth. And then, of course, him being the truth, then what he teaches and what he's taught through his apostles are continuation of that truth.
I want to get to her next statement there, Scott.
All right, Drew, what does he say to him?
She says, in verse 25, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Now, there's 2 points there that just pop right out to me. This is early on in John's gospel, so this is early on if it's chronologically ordered, early on in his ministry. But he really comes right out and just says it, doesn't it? Clear as a bell. I am the Messiah who you know is coming.
And very rare for Jesus. This is not what he usually does among the Jews. He'll point to evidences and such, but not just state this. But he'll do it later for the blind man, and he does it in this private conversation with her. Just comes right out and says, I am he.
And
imagine you're the woman.
Yeah.
A few minutes ago, you're kind of annoyed at this guy for this Jewish guy who's making conversation with you, asking for water, and then you kind of mock him a bit, and then he starts saying, well, you ought to ask me to give water. You never be thirsty again. Oh, yeah, who do you think you are? You think you're better than Jacob? And then suddenly, yeah, you've had 5 men, and the one you have now isn't your man.
Yeah.
So
Oops.
you're a prophet. I have a question. And then he answers that. And then she says, well, I know that the Messiah is coming. And then he says, I'm him. Wow.
Well, you know what else she's part of her question is, number one, she knows the Messiah is coming. And when he comes, he will tell us all things.
Yeah.
Now, that's a little bit different than what the Jews back in Jerusalem, their impression. Their Messiah is one of a physical king, a militaristic ruler type of Messiah. This woman is talking about one who's going to speak.
Teach, yeah, more teaching.
More of a spiritual leader. I don't know if I'm making more of it than it's there, but isn't that, she might be getting that out of Deuteronomy. I think I had that up here somewhere. Yeah, in Deuteronomy, right? In
18:18.
Yeah, and that's talking about where God says, I'm going to raise up a prophet like you, Moses. They need to listen to him.
Yeah, when he comes,
that word, listen.
Him.
Yes. And that the language there is pretty strong. He says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. So there's a strong connection there between the prophet like Moses being the one who speaks all that God has given to him. And here she says, when Messiah comes, he will tell us all things.
And that's what she's saying. Go ahead.
All right. Just then the disciples come. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. So they've come back. They're in Samaria, which is, remember, Jews have no dealings with Samaria. They left Jesus well, and they come back. And here's Jesus, and he's talking to this woman, and she's a Samaritan woman. They're having a conversation. But nobody said, what do you seek? Or why are you talking with her?
Don't you find that interesting, Scott? I want to interrupt you. Where did they go? They went to buy food. Where did they go buy food?
No, they would have bought it from Samaritans.
They didn't go all the way back down to Judea to get it.
No, they didn't.
Now, I'm trying to imagine them with the animosity between these two cultures. It doesn't say that Jesus said, go get food. It just says they went to get food. But can you imagine that? They're going down there in this town. Oh, we got to deal with these people and buy food from them. And they do, and they bring it back up. And I bring that up because now they got all of this food.
Yeah, and of course there's all sorts of places today where people are in a foreign country that they don't like the people there, or traveling here or there, and hey, when it's time to get some food, you go buy the food. You may be annoyed with them, you maybe talk about them after you leave, but when people need stuff, they will transact business with the people they need to get it from. But
go ahead.
What's surprising to them, Jesus didn't, in their view, have to talk with that woman. They needed to buy some food from the Samaritans, but what on earth is Jesus doing talking with this Samaritan woman?
Exactly.
So the woman left her water jar, went away into town, and said to the people, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. And of course, she's remembering what he said about these men. Can this be the Christ? They went out of the town and are coming to him.
And I think it's interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Stephen.
You may be about to mention this, I don't know, but the woman leaves her jar.
Yeah.
She came for the whole purpose of getting water from Jacob's well.
Yeah.
And now her thought process has been totally taken to thinking about what Jesus is saying and who is he's just said he's the Messiah. He's told me about my life and doesn't know me. And so water jar forgotten. She runs home, and is all about come and see who this is.
Yeah. What two little parables in Matthew 13 does this kind of principle remind you of, where here's what you've been doing and you leave all that aside for something else?
one seeking the fine pearls, the merchant, and the guy who stumbles across the treasure in the field, and both of them sell all they've got.
Everything they've got to get this one thing. So that jug was no longer important. She might have been real thirsty, but all of a sudden, or water that they would have been using for the afternoon, that's secondary right now. She went away, said, "Come see a man told me all I ever did. Can this be Christ?" So what do the people in town do?
Well, they've got to go out there and see for themselves.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." He said to them, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" But Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and accomplish his work." Comments on that part?
Yeah. I recall in the past, my wife would prepare a great big dinner and I'm not hungry. What her thoughts were after she went and did that. Here they are bringing back food, and it was around the noon hour, and he's definitely hungry. They know that. And then they're going, "Where did he get food from? There's nobody else here." And that woman was here. She ran away. There was no food. So I find that interesting. Like they're saying, where did he get this food from?
It's also interesting. Go ahead, Scott.
One of you guys go. Go ahead.
It's also just interesting that he says something pretty similar to the disciples that he had said to the Samaritan woman. He says, "Well, if you knew who you're talking to, you'd ask me and I'd give you living water." And then here the disciples come back and say, "We got food." And he's like, "Listen, I got food you don't know about." And it's just interesting that Jesus uses these images of food and drink. He'll later use it a couple chapters and later in John 6 to say, "You got to eat my flesh and drink my blood." He'll take it to kind of the next level. But he wants them to rethink the way they look at these common necessities and uses these images to point them back to himself.
And also that both Jesus and the woman have put aside the immediate, interest in food and water. She left the water jug behind, and the food's there now. That's not what he's focused on. Instead, look what he says. He says, "My food is to do the will who sent me to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest." Go back to verse 30. After the woman went to town and said this, what did the people do in verse 30?
Ran out to come to
They're coming out of town to him. Now, do you remember that picture we had at the beginning that showed Jacob's well, and you can see kind of the valley and the hills and everything around? Let me run back that real quick. Okay.
What you're getting at
She's
is that
gone to
you
town.
see them coming up.
Yeah. And if they're dressed, as a lot of Middle Eastern people seem to have done sometimes, dressed in white, a good color for, if you dress in black, that's going to be a lot hotter and stuff. If you picture, people in maybe because of white flowing robes kind of heading out that way. And he said, "You say it's 4 months till harvest, but lift up your eyes and look at the fields. They're already white unto the harvest." Which brings us then back to the text. Well, no, I went too far.
I think it's interesting here again that Jesus redirects his disciples' attention from, like Scott mentioned earlier, from their immediate hunger and preoccupation with, hey, it's lunchtime, to, listen, there is work to be done right now. There are opportunities that you're missing if you're not paying attention. Look, don't wait for the harvest.
Yeah.
The harvest is now, Look, lift up your eyes, look out, see these people coming. And of course, these are people that, though they may have bought lunch from them, they were not wanting really to have any more interaction than they needed to with these people. And Jesus is saying, listen, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. And that's the work that he's inviting the disciples to do, is the work of reaching out to people, of loving them despite their cultural differences, and sharing the gospel with them.
And then Jesus says, already, so after saying the fields are white for harvest, already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may rejoice together. It's a little bit different, two different stages here, but you remember in Corinth, Paul said, I planted and Apollos watered. Here, you've got one sows and another reaps. And that's what Jesus says in verse 37. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps.
I have a question for you, Scott.
Yeah.
So who's the reaper, who's the sower in this scene?
You've got Moses. The Samaritans do use the books of Moses. There's work that Moses did centuries and centuries before that's laid the groundwork for now what can be reaped. We all ride so much on the work of people of the past. Even as when we're preaching sometimes, we forget things that we've heard from other people. One brother that I just really learned a lot from and just really love and appreciate a lot was Robert Turner, who was an older brother who died many, many years ago. And I remember a lot of things, I remember some things that I learned from Robert Turner, but I've forgotten how much I learned from Robert Turner, because sometimes somebody will say something to me, they'll say, it's like Brother Turner said, and they'll say something, and it's something I say, and I'd forgotten where I got it from. I could even think that I'd thought of that or something. Oh, now I know where I got that. But but just think the work of the prophets in the Old Testament, the work of Jesus, the work of the apostles, people who translated the Bible into our language, or maybe people back in our family line, people who taught the people that taught us, all this work gone in, and now it's our turn.
I also think, just on a very literal note in this text, it's going to be interesting that in Acts chapter 8, you're going to have some of the disciples coming back to Samaria to spread the gospel. Philip will come, but then Peter and John are sent up after that, and they would be present for this. Yeah. And all the seeds that Jesus is sowing here, they're going to come back and reap some benefit and blessing from the work of Jesus.
Excellent. And would they not think back to this occasion with the woman at the well, back when they had been so surprised that Jesus was talking to that woman?
Exactly. Good answer.
Many Samaritan, and we're about out of time. We're down here to about 1 minute, and we're to our last text, so I'll read it, and then you guys wind up with whatever comments you have. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. And they said to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world.
Oh, that's powerful. They did believe her, right? But they had to now go out to confirm themselves, and now their faith is directly because of what they heard.
Yeah, kind of like the Bereans who listened and then searched to see for themselves.
Yeah, don't take it on my word. What does the scripture say? And see and read it for yourself.
Yeah, and it's kind of like chapter 1, Philip and Nathaniel. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, come and see. And then he says, truly, you're the Son of God. So same type of thing here with the Samaritans.
And perhaps, Drew, you had mentioned before that, of course, there would have been varying degrees of perception, but one of the perceptions Jerusalem had to do with power and independence and stuff. But notice here, their perception is Savior of the world.
Exactly. They don't even use the term king.
Savior of the world.
That spiritual leader concept is what they had. Good point. Now, I know we're past the time a little bit, but you know what? We got to mention about next week, Scott. We're not going to be doing the show live next week.
That's true.
Audience, we want to let you know that next week we're going to not be here.
We're all going to be tied up in a lecture at Exton, and so Drew will pick one of the past programs and broadcast that for us next Tuesday at 2. Right?
Can we call that the best of BibleQuest.org? Well, actually, I'll have
BibleQuest.org, but that might not be as good of an idea.
Yeah, but well, listen, the whole list of all of the broadcasts is there. You scroll down and you want to pick one that you haven't seen before. You don't want to miss doing it. We're not going to be here live, but you can just then watch it. Of course, you can't ask questions, but so look, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott and Steve.
Thank you, guys.
For your input today, and thank you, everyone in your audience.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.